Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you may be. I'm very honored to be hosting this session during the first Nobel Prize Summit, Our Planet, Our Future, which obviously is a very appropriate theme. Myself, as the co-president of the Club of Rome, alongside my partners in crime in this incredible session, which I hope will really bring forward some very deep new thinking, but also important actions that we would like to put forward to all of you around the need to look at our planet, look at our future, and plan for alternative futures that take into consideration the planetary boundaries. I'm here joined by Johan Rockstam of the Potsdam Institute, and we'll be joined later also by Per Espen of the Norwegian Business School and the Swedish Resilience Center in terms of some of the panelists that will be before you today. Humanity is now the largest driver of change on Earth, and clearly this Nobel Laureate Summit has brought forward some of the greatest brains and some of the greatest scientists and humanists who have been talking about this deep existential risk that we have with regard to our own existence on this planet as we look at the tipping points before us of biodiversity loss, climate change, and now a human-made health pandemic. Ultimately, if we are to value our future, we need to value resilience in societies and in nature. We need to look at interlocking systems and integrative systems approaches in order to understand how to really shift towards those kinds of actions that are going to make our footprint much less and ensure that we can survive on this planet that we call home. That means that we need to find the right balance between lives and livelihoods, and I'm sure that Sharon Burrow in particular, who will join us later on our Transformational Economics panel, will reflect with us on what that also means for jobs for people so that we can ensure that they continue to have livelihoods as we move into these new alternative futures. How do we do that is something we will explore in this session. How do we find those very intricate balances between nature, people, peace, and prosperity? So I'm going to ask Johan to give us a bit of what his feeling is. And I know you've been speaking about this for the last couple of days, Johan. Where are we in terms of the planetary boundaries? And also deep congratulations on your new film with David Attenborough on this very point.
Yeah, thanks, Sandrine, and great to be with all of you. And just to share with you that it's the first time ever that a Nobel Prize Summit is held. It's the first time ever that this scientific gathering is hosted at the National Academy of Sciences, and it's basically science standing on its own evidence to reach out to humanity about what I would argue to be the most dramatic conclusion in the history of modern humans on planet Earth, namely that we've reached a state of planetary emergency. That's not a small thing. That has never been declared before, and we hope that it will never more have to be declared, because now is the moment we are facing two large risks to take for future generations on Earth. And one simply has to start with the basics. We have now warmed up the global mean temperature on Earth to 1.2 degrees Celsius. That might seem like a small step, but in fact, this is, we know today unequivocally, the warmest temperature on Earth since we left the last ice age 12,000 years ago. And already at 1.2, can you imagine, we see unequivocal evidence that we have transgressed 3 tipping points already. The number one is the Doomsday Glaciers in West Antarctica. You've all read about them, the Thwaites and the Pine Island glaciers. The second one is the summer sea ice in the Arctic, which is now rushing towards a ice-free summer state, impacting the jet stream, the Gulf Stream, and the weather patterns in the Northern Hemisphere. And the third and final victim are the tropical coral reefs at 1.2. And we are increasing the temperature with 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade. So we are actually on a trajectory that would cross the 1.5 degrees Celsius climate planetary boundary somewhere between 2035 and 2040. What does that mean? Well, that means pain. That means rushing towards more heat waves, disease, droughts, floods, hurricanes, more impacts on particularly vulnerable communities in the world. Would the planet be knocked over? The answer is probably no. There's a scientific debate about this, but it's not until we reach 2 degrees Celsius that we have more and more evidence that this is the point when we are at risk of really crossing thresholds of irreversible change. That's why this is the decisive decade. We cannot risk that. Now is the time to recognize that risk times the decisive decade means emergency. We need to become managers of all the global commons. We need transformational economics. And it's not only about decarbonizing the energy system, it's also about keeping the Earth resilience intact. So that is the charge, Sandrine, for the transformational economics.
Thanks so much, Johan, and I couldn't agree with you more. Confronting these tipping points and understanding how we can build resilience across different systems. And as co-chair also of the resilience track in the food system, we're speaking about this very point now. We also need to speak about those very clear social tipping points that many of us have seen, whether it be Black Lives Matter, whether it be, again, the jobs and the livelihoods that we are thinking about, which we must bring back post-COVID and ensure that people can live on a livable planet, but continue to work and be active citizens. And for this, we're going to need systemic transformation to truly emerge from emergency, taking into consideration these key social tipping points, which must be addressed. Political progress, market forces, technological disruption that will then enable to, as you said, not just think about zero carbon, but also zero loss of nature, zero poverty, zero pandemics. And what we're increasingly even asking is for universal access to food and ensuring that we have universal wages. So really taking into consideration the depth of what we are facing in terms of both the planetary tipping points and also these important social tipping points. The progress is visible, and we're seeing that they're the next generation of political leaders have embraced new economic models, whether it be in Finland, in Iceland, in Scotland, in Wales, or in New Zealand, where we're looking at new models around well-being, which are structured around social, economic, and environmental pillars and indicators. We're also looking very much at one of our Club of Rome members presenting to many local jurisdictions around donut economics and how we ensure that we survive within those planetary boundaries, taking into consideration very key social indicators to ensure that we thrive through communities and human well-being. So to conclude, we are not yet there, and we need to make rapid progress before 2030. We've called for action, all of us, to ensure that we reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030. And we've put forward, as the Club of Rome with the Potsdam Institute and the Norwegian Business School, a new initiative which will respond to these changes, including a Transformational Economics Commission and the exciting work that you will be leading with Potsdam Institute scientists, but also with the Norwegian Business School around the new modeling for pathways for change. Can you give us a little bit of what you will be doing in this instance, Johan, and how some of that modeling is going to be put together? We know that we need to flesh out those transformative and synergetic turnarounds. And with EarthForAll in this new project together, we hope that we can both put in place those pathways through some deep modeling that's building actually on the original limits to growth modeling that we already did as the Club of Rome 50 years ago. But in addition, improving decision-making and putting forward clear policy scenarios to ensure that indeed we have aligned scenarios that we can propose to policymakers around new types of well-being economies. So what is your thinking around the next steps with regard to this project?
No, this is really exciting and really important. For the first time, we are really kind of gathering around the grand question: how can we attain the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, a prosperous and equitable future for all, within a stable and resilient planet that remains within the planetary boundaries. That requires sustainable development pathway modeling. We are integrating the frontier of integrated assessment modeling tools together with global system dynamics modeling capabilities, and building on, just as you say, Sandrine, building on the experience from the 1972 limits to growth, with all the advancements we've seen from then in terms of all the big data, but also in sectoral innovation pathways, to explore basically turning every stone on how can we scale and accelerate the transitions towards an equitable and prosperous future which is resilient. It will be about energy transitions, of course. It will include food system transitions. It will include different development models of welfare economics to try and really have circular economics, putting price on nature, price on carbon, all the policy elements that we now have so much experience from, but that have to be put into work. Inequality. How can we ensure a transition towards a safe future that still addresses inequalities around the world? And the fifth and final fundamental will be around gender, population dynamics, education. How can we ensure a future where all people have the same access to knowledge, but also the same possibilities of having a balanced family planning future? Now, all of these will be integrated and will be dialogued through a whole platform of different integrated modeling capabilities. And what is unique in this case is that we'll be exploring these futures, but always validating and calibrating them back to the Earth system modeling assessments that we also have within the project.
Thank you, Jan. And I think what's also very unique about this project is that it will be an iterative project. It will be also trying to gauge what policymakers are thinking about the modeling results, stress test them, as we indicated, through this Transformational Economics Commission of commissioners coming from across the globe, north and south, very different types of economies. And then also bringing in the public, ensuring that actually we have a broader information campaign and process where we can better understand what citizens' needs are and what their vision of alternative futures are. So this project is incredibly exciting, and I continue to be excited to work with you on this project alongside all the others who have joined us, who are really trying to make sure that actually what we will have in the next year is some possible 5 to 10 year plans of where decision makers can use short-term levers to really ensure long-term transformational change. So very exciting indeed. And this is the opening of part of our conversation that we hope to really build on today and continue to build on. So I'd like to now bring forward Andrew Steer, an old dear friend, who also, as many of you know, has been spearheading all the incredible work of the World Resources Institute. But as many of us are incredibly excited, Andrew, that you are now shifting to another Earth project. So we're the EarthForAll, you are moving towards the Bezos Earth Fund. And really what I'd like to understand from you, Andrew, as you're making this shift, is how do you see and what do you see is the greatest opportunity to accelerate transformation? Is it shifting the capital? Is it more intellectual know-how, more decision-making power or political will? What for you is really needed to accelerate the transition by 2030?
Well, thanks, Sandrine, and thanks, Johan. I listening to you, I am inspired. I agree with every word. Congratulations on your new project. Congratulations, Sandrine, on what you're doing at the Club of Rome. Really very exciting, and how great to be here this morning. The answer to the question is all of the above, Sandrine. Do finances need to move? Yes. How incredibly exciting it is that now almost $40 trillion of financial assets are committed to net zero. They now need to figure out what the net zero means, and they need to then figure out what they're going to do about it in the next 5 to 10 years. All to play for this year, all to play for this decade. I want to make just one sort of starting point, which is the title of this session is Transformational Economics. And one thing I think we need to be careful not to do is sort of blame the them, blame the economists, blame the economic professions. Actually, they're not the problem. We are. If you look at the Nobel Prize in economics, in the early days, most of the prizes were won for showing the beauty and perfection of perfect competition. Almost all Nobel Prizes in economics since then have been for demonstrating actually that free markets are extremely imperfect. So in other words, the economics profession, just like the health profession or just like the physics profession, is going through a journey. And actually what we need to do is learn from the best economics today. Don't criticize them, criticize those of us that vote for politicians that do not understand it, criticize ourselves for not behaving in a way that is suggested. Take, for example, measures of welfare. What we tend to do is say, oh, GDP, that's so wicked. But Simon Kuznets, who won the Nobel Prize, who created the system of national accounts, he was crystal clear this is not to measure well-being. And what we need to do on the environmental side is do exactly what you're doing now. We need to be as smart as they were back then 50 years ago to develop new measures. And then we need to thrust them in to the way we do business. There's another concept that the social sciences and economics bring to us that are absolutely crucial for this decade. And it's called path dependency. And what path dependency means is we're on a path. We know it's a bad path. We know that this makes no sense. And we actually know there's a much better path. But the problem is there are mountains between the path we're on and the path we need to get to. So take, for example, the way we travel in cities. It makes no sense in the United States to lose $1 trillion of income, especially for the poor, because we sit in traffic for 20 billion hours a year, wasting our time. Actually, there's a much better way, and it would cost less. It relates to public transport. It relates to green energy and so on. The problem is there are so many vested interests. There are so much capital that's locked in. And the important point for us in this decade, when you say what needs to happen, is to understand the meaning of disruptive change. Most of us tend to think disruptive change, why can't we just have change? Disruptive change is when you've got path dependency. It's when you cannot move gradually from the system we have. And so what happened 2 years ago was totally inspiring. The IPCC came out with a report that said, actually, 2 degrees is too hot. We have to keep temperatures to below 1.5. It will be much, much more difficult to do that. And you know what happened? A lot of people said, wow, watch out. The politicians and the business will run for the hills. This will be too difficult for them. In fact, the opposite happened. A whole new generation of leaders came out. Why? Because actually real leaders want to lead, and they understood this point about disruptive change. So when Boris Johnson says, we are not going to allow any internal combustion engines to be sold after 2020, and General Motors says, we're not going to sell them after 2030, I should have said, 2030. That's disruptive change. When Prime Minister Modi comes in as Prime Minister, and he's not a member of the Sierra Club, but he said, actually 3 gigatons of gigawatts of solar is not enough. I want 100. Suddenly, that's disruptive change. Why? Because suddenly the investors realize, my goodness me, it's a new economy out there. This is not incremental. This is something big. There's going to be new factories, new institutes, billions of dollars, big employment. We want to be part of it. So that is the tipping point that we need to go through. It's a mind shift, and we need to learn from the best economics. At the same time, we should insist that where economics is wrong, such as bad economics of discount rates, where we devalue the future too much, weak modeling in economics of the dynamics of system change and technology. So there's a lot that economics needs to get right, but we also need to learn from those brave Nobel Prize winners, since we're celebrating them today, that actually have introduced new ways of thinking.
Thanks, Andrew. And I think you bring up several very, very important points. One is pathway dependency. And clearly, through some of our pathways work, we will be looking at that dependency and how we can create those radical shifts, not just coming out of the internal combustion engine, by the way, but also totally diversifying our fossil energy and into renewables, electrification, and other modes. So you're absolutely correct. And I think that your other point on the Nobel laureates, and clearly the richness of the Club of Rome has always been to foster debate and to understand that we're not always going to be aligned in terms of our thinking. What we do need to do is question some of that neoliberal thinking that has gone wrong, exactly as you say, and put in place the new economic models that are fit for purpose for the future that we want to create. And I think that's really what the next session is going to address. And I want to thank you, first of all, for your commitment, but also I very much hope that we will be able to continue to work together now in your new line of work, where you will be starting to bank on where some funding should go in this very important area. So thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you, Sandrine. Amen.
Take care. So moving on now to Per Espen Stoknes, who will actually be introducing this next panel, the Transformational Economics Valuing for the Future. A very important panel that builds also on one that we had during the Race to Zero dialogues that were organized last November. And we are sticking to our theme, which is bringing forward new economic thinking, and in particular, new economic thinking that is being championed also by women. So Per Espen, as the man on the panel who will be chairing an all-women's panel, I'm pointing now to you to take over.
Thanks so much, Sandrine. So I'm Per Espen Stoknes, and first of all, I must say it's an honor for me to facilitate such an outstanding all-women panel on this important issue, with Jayati Ghosh, Ilona Otto, Carlota Perez, Sharon Burrow, and Jennifer Hinton. And with my background in both psychology and economics, I came to think of one of the controversial stereotypes in psychology, that the male brain is more aggressive and linear, while the female brain is more empathetic and holistic. I'm certainly not going into that issue here, but I simply want to declare that I'm delighted today to facilitate such a high-level all-women panel on systemic issues and look forward to learning a lot. Because most often, governments and the public treat the health, inequality, climate and biodiversity issues as separate crises. So accordingly, there is the health ministry, there is the social and family ministry, there is the environmental ministry, and of course the financial ministry. Separate ministers, separate strategies, separate policies and separate goals. So there are 17 SDGs, there are 9 planetary boundaries that Johan Rockström outlined, there are 200 countries, and we only have a few decades in which to reprogram this agro-industrial economic system of ours. So what are the potential key policy levers for the 21st century that deliver not only inside one silo, but systemic levers that delivers multiple benefits across silos? And why can these key levers work across health, inequality and climate domains? At the BI Norwegian Business School, we've researched and taught key sustainability issues for more than 20 years, mainly from a systems and systems dynamics perspective, particularly inspired by Professor Jürgen Randers and the Limits to Growth tradition. Actually, one of the inputs into EarthForAll project is the 2018 research project Earth-3, where we kind of warmed up and explored some key policy levers with the broadest systemic impacts. And also, this month, I've just published a new book on the topic called Tomorrow's Economy on MIT Press that summarizes our research, teachings and explores these issues. How can we, meaning all meaning all humans who participate in the modern economy, create systems change rather than climate change? You know, what the kids said on the streets pre-COVID. So how can we measure? How can we navigate this multi-dimensional complex system of incomes, wealth, ecosystems, natural values and cultural and social values? Or simply put, how do you recognize real systems change when you see it and when it's not there? So for this discussion and this panel, I've suggested we focus on the word convergence. What economic policies and levers for change are necessary in order to confront the convergence of health, inequality, climate and biodiversity crisis? How do we guarantee a just transition? How do we best replicate and bring to scale success stories at national, regional and international levels? So these are the grand questions, but I'm sure the panel participants can pull it down to concrete levels. So to kick off, one of the key inspirators for my book on tomorrow's economy was the work of Carlota Perez, and her research on the techno-economic paradigm shifts, like the recent wave of digital innovation over the last decades. So Carlota, handing over to you, why is digitalization, which is often seen as a threat to jobs, robots and AI, etc., actually something that can also create a greener, smarter economy with more jobs, not less? What does it take?
Well, that's a very important question. And thank you very much for the very good introduction about the need for systemic convergent policies. I think basically, if we think of convergence when referring to the policies we need, we're talking about sustainability. We're talking about economic, social, and environmental sustainability. But of those three, because it's so obvious that we're doing the environmental sustainability as the sort of central thing in terms of this big transition, I would emphasize social sustainability as a job-creating green economy. Now, that's a huge challenge. Up to now, we have already had 3 waves of job destruction. We've had technology, which is going to continue destroying jobs. We've had globalization, which might no longer be so high a job destroying thing for the advanced world. And it might be actually creating still jobs in the developing world, but not as many. And then we had the COVID pandemic. So we've had 3 waves of job destruction, of skill destruction, of regional destruction. We must not have a 4th wave. We had all this resentment as a result, and they're right to be resentful, but maybe they're not right to follow the populists. But what is everybody else offering? We're not offering an alternative, and the populists are offering heaven, and people are believing it because at least somebody's offering something. Austerity is not going to get us anywhere, and certainly not to a green economy. We need tons of investment, tons of jobs. We really need to make an enormous transformation, which means innovation, investment, and work. So I would like, in terms of that, to make 2 useful historical parallels: the post-war reconstruction of Europe and the Cold War challenge. You know, we could see the post-pandemic moment as post-war reconstruction, because we're not just reconstructing what COVID destroyed, we're reconstructing everything we've been destroying for the past 50 years almost. So we also would need probably to see the environmental threat as the Cold War. So if we see post-war reconstruction, we need a Marshall Plan now for the developing world, not just for the destroyed, whatever is destroyed in the advanced world. We would need to face now to use the environmental threat as the Cold War. In what terms? First of all, the fear of communism, the threat of communism made the West aim for social peace through greater social justice, unions, high wages, home ownership. So all that created demand, which in turn became a source of incentive for innovation and investment. And we had an enormous wave of innovation pushed by the challenge of the Cold War. So, you know, going to the moon was about weapons that could go to the other side of the world. So now we could have a much better challenge and have that enormous incentive to innovation in terms of investment. They were both funded through proactive government action. And now that at last, through the pandemic, we understood the role of government again, and we abandoned this ridiculous free market totalitarianism, we are on a much better track to get to a point where we will achieve this social sustainability together with economic and environmental sustainability.
Excellent, Carlotta. Thanks. That's very exciting thoughts. And some would say, however, that this innovation system always results in the winners taking all. And Jayati Ghosh, you're the professor of economics and the UN High-Level Advisory Board on Economic and Social Affairs. And you focused on the inequalities and fiscal measures in your research, which are then affecting several other concerns, exemplified with the horrid developments in India just now. So, do we stand a chance of reversing the escalation of inequality within countries if we pursue this innovation drive?
Thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. And it's always such a privilege and an inspiration to hear Carlotta. So thank you for allowing me to be part of this. You know, I'm so glad you mentioned convergence as the idea, because right now what we really have to do is address this massive and growing divergence. And I would argue that it's not just that inequality is one of the pillars. If we do not address the inequalities, we will not be able to do anything else. We will not be able to do the sustainability issues. We will not be able to make any paradigm shift. We will not be able to generate any strategies of economic expansion that do not destroy the planet. So I believe that the dealing with inequalities is absolutely urgent and essential right now. And I have to confess that I'm rather disappointed. I believed that the shock of the pandemic would make people realize what everybody said. All the world leaders came out and said that, oh, we're all in this together and no one is safe till everyone is safe. It turns out these were all words. None of the actions of the leaders of the rich countries has expressed any of that. The actions have been blatantly nationalist. There have been vaccine grabs. There have been attempts to placate the pharma lobby at the expense of everyone else in the world, to continue with patents that are clearly destroying the capacity of the global system to increase vaccines and thereby bring an end to the pandemic. There is incredible emphasis on huge fiscal expansion in the North, which is excellent. I'm all for it. I think it's very good, without enabling or allowing similar fiscal expansion in the developing countries. So we have had in the United States, where I am at the moment, 30% of GDP has been spent over 1 year, additionally, in fiscal terms, for dealing with all the various issues that have arisen in the pandemic and with a strong green element, with a strong focus on renewable energy and sustainability, which is all to be welcomed. By comparison, in the developing world, the average increase in fiscal spending over the last year was about 4%. In the least developed countries, the poorest countries, it was 2%. So there's really been nothing. And if you're looking at 2% of their GDP, we're talking about $2 per year, per capita increase. That's the kind of fiscal expansion you got last year in the least developed countries. This is really not something that is, again, inevitable. It is an outcome of the way we have structured our global relationships. And I'm afraid it's also an outcome of these strategies being pursued by people in the rich countries. None of this is, of course, desirable, ethical, just, and so on, but it's also unsustainable. The absence of a fiscal space for developing countries, which is coming about because we're not getting a dramatic increase in the SDRs. We still haven't got 1.5 years into the pandemic in the IMF's liquidity. We are not getting any restraints on capital flows, which continue to wreak havoc in developing countries. We are not getting any attempts at debt restructuring, which is absolutely essential because the burden of debt is preventing so many countries from being able to spend more. And we are not getting systematic efforts to do something about the global food system, which has already generated massive hunger and is going to create even more as we speak in many of these poor developing countries and in many emerging economies as well. As a result, what do we see? We find that the great divergence is not only for all of the reasons that I have mentioned, but it's also in terms of strategies for a greener, multicolored, more sustainable recovery. So the developing countries, including my country, India, which I noticed that Mr. Modi, Prime Minister Modi, was favorably mentioned in the previous session as making very good announcements about climate. What have they done? They have all deregulated environment over the past year. They have encouraged more carbon investments. more coal investments, more fossil fuels of all kinds. They have opened up doors to the worst kinds of not just dirty and brown, but climate damaging investments in a desperate attempt to attract and generate economic growth at any cost. I'm not excusing them, but I'm pointing out that most countries now feel they have no option because, let's face it, the North has abandoned them. Let's not kid ourselves about this. And as long as that happens, all the talk of systemic change and how do we do this together, it doesn't mean anything unless we can force some greater global cooperation and solidarity among the countries that can actually make a difference. Just one positive note to end on, I think there's the beginnings of that. We have seen the Biden administration make some positive noises about tax cooperation, which are absolutely essential. And it's very interesting to see that once Janet Yellen makes such statements, that a lot of European governments that had been bitterly opposing it so far suddenly fall in line. So there is hope. I think there is some hope for greater cooperation. But at the moment, what we have is actually adding to divergence. And just saying that we should all be in it together doesn't mean anything.
Thanks for spelling out those troubling developments so clearly, Jayati. We also have this issue of inequality on the jobs level. And Sharon Burrow, you represent nothing less than 180 million workers by leading the International Trade Union Confederation. Inequality is, as Jayati just outlined, at least on a par with planetary crisis. And we have the escalating inequality crisis, which then spill over into health crisis. And what are your top convergent policy levers you recommend? And why just these in the light of this convergence red thread we have?
Well, following Carlotta and Jayoti is an enormous task, but I could kiss both of them because they've framed the issue around jobs and the convergence with other areas of planetary destruction that we need to deal with very capably. But I would simply add and say, if we don't get a shift in the economic model, then the damage we've seen from the kind of waves that Carlotta talks about, the inequality Jayoti talks about, the damage to both people through rights violations, income inequality, the inequality of gender and race, and of course, then the damage to the planet, to climate, to biodiversity, to the other planetary boundaries. If we don't get a shift in the economic model, then this damage to everybody continues. So we need to rethink the way we operate. And I love listening to young people who talk about the fact that if you can't reuse or recycle products, don't use them in the first place. So we have to be much more adventurous. And Sandrine leading the Club of Rome with others on the modeling work they're doing in transformational economics, I'm very proud to be part of. But from our perspective, every area of work, every industry must transition. We know that there are simply no jobs on a dead planet. And if we don't actually deal with the convergence that looks to the issues of inequality, of job destruction, of income loss, and indeed of the climate emergency, we won't indeed make the race. So every industry, the role of cities is increasingly important because it will not just drive change, it will drive circular economies within cities and increasingly with the demand and supply curves into the jobs of manufacturing or food producing communities in the hinterlands or indeed around the world. If we get trade reform, then we will see the jobs that we need. To give you a sense of what the job targets are, given that May 1 is coming up in just a couple of days' time, can I tell you, we would need to meet the SDG target of Goal 8, 575 million jobs in the formal sector by 2030. And indeed, we will need to look at the informal economy because we have a broken labour market where 2 billion people are working informally with no rights, no rule of law, no minimum wage, no income except if they can get work or income on a daily basis. And they're the sectors that the majority of our agriculture comes from. Apart from the human dignity of that, the climate and the trade realities of this is, so we've set a target of 1 billion jobs being formalized. It's easy. A minimum living wage and social protection, or if it's not a dependent wage, income makes that possible. But for climate and for the dignity of decent work, we need to change the investment lens as well. We have around $40 trillion of workers' capital, pension funds in the global economy. Every dollar, every euro, every piece of investment must have an ESG lens. So this new modelling is so, so important if we're going to shift the way we actually create jobs, deal with innovation. But I wanted to say one other thing. There's good news, and Carlotta knows that. If you just take renewable energy, for every 10 jobs, there's 5 to 10 jobs in supply chains. There's 3 times that if you have decent wages in the economy that working people create by spending, indeed, their wages. And of course, if we look at resilience and adaptation, then we need care and social protection. And if you invest in aged care, childcare, healthcare, education, you get even more jobs than you do in the traditional male economies. And up to twice as many, although we'd like to see that reduced with greater income and quality for women's work. But we need new models, and all of us working together. And what a panel to be on, what amazing women with Sandrine, and of course with Johan and you and Andrew. It's been a pretty good show to date. So, but I like the fact that the women dominate. You wouldn't be surprised to hear that, because it doesn't happen very often. New economics, new models. Let's work together to make it happen and end the silos.
Excellent. Thanks, Sharon. And yeah, thanks, thumbs up. And thanks for bringing up also the link between renewable energies and agriculture to new jobs. Because there was a question in the live chat about convergence. What is it actually? And the way we envision to deal with this in the EarthForAll project is to see how the same levers like renewable energy can address both jobs, health in terms of cleaner air, and also better economic improvement, in particularly in those low-income countries. Second, if we look at the problem with climate change and the food system, how that also threatens biodiversity, maybe by shifting the food system and the way we use land, there would be better jobs, better health, and also better economic development in low-income countries. And I want to send the ball to you now, Ilona Otto, because you're professor of societal impact of climate change at University of Graz, and you work at the Potsdam Institute with Johan for the PIC. And in terms of land use change, food is the main driver, killing old growth forest, creating biodiversity loss. How can we accelerate this transition from fossil-intensive, highly processed foods and food waste to a more nourishing food system that serves both health, converging with soil, and inequality?
Yeah, thank you for this question, and and for the invitation to this panel. It's great to listen to this discussion. And of course, the questions you ask are very complex, so there are no simple answers. But this is what I was thinking about, that the land use sector is like the sector that brings different aspects of health and climate mitigation, climate adaptation, biodiversity, and diets together. So it's definitely like extremely important sector, and we need to understand better what can work and what cannot. And definitely in terms of diets, like as you say, I think one of the key question is that also in energy production, by the way, that maybe we need to also kind of transfer or change our thinking of consumers, not only as consumers, but also producers, yeah? So that you don't only, that you view citizens not only as sort of agents, who only buy and consume, but also who are kind of like active agents and agents of change, yeah? And in a way, yeah, if so I'm doing it myself at a very small scale, but in a way, if you have like a small garden and some trees, you can make a part of your food yourself, yeah, and you also learn. I think it's great also for children that you learn how to process food and actually how much work it costs. Also, you eat less than processed food, so it has those kind of multiple benefits. I'm not saying everyone should become a small-scale farmer, but there is something in this thinking that also in terms of energy production, like how many people own buildings or family houses, and if you think that we could put solar panels on some of our roofs, we can also contribute to those changes. So this is what is kind of driving me, this kind of recognition of the agency that you have and those kind of and levels of change that you can kind of recognize in your own life. And was also what Andrew Steer was talking about, that sort of like, we have to see ourselves as a solution, like as agents providing solutions to different problems. And maybe shortly also on inequalities, that it's not only about economic inequalities, but there are also those large carbon inequalities. So actually, like very small share of global population is responsible for disproportionately high share of lifestyle carbon emissions. And of course, I'm talking about people like millionaires and billionaires. And they are also people who have extremely high agency, yeah, because they have the resources, they know the decision makers, or maybe they are the decision makers themselves, and they are part of the global elite. So I think in this way, they also need to take more responsibility and become a part of the solution. And maybe finally, if you think about climate agreements that they are made between national governments, I think we need more private sector participation, also more citizenship organizations, yeah, because I think it's kind of in a way we all need to become a part of the solution. Thank you.
Thanks, Ilona. Very important point. And also, I'm wondering now if anybody else want to interact with each other, you can give me a note in the chat. So finally, Jennifer Hinton, you're a seasoned activist with 2 PhDs, as if one wasn't enough, and work at the Stockholm Resilience Center. I saw a lot of comments here in the Twitter live chat about population challenge, for instance. There was one here saying, how are we to solve problems like human overpopulation, even when self-proclaimed experts willfully refuse to communicate openly about it? And we do know, for instance, that with education and job access, particularly for women, this has a huge impact on the population development, as well as women's well-being. But how and why is this among the most powerful levers for both health, population and climate issues? Any comments there, Jennifer?
Actually, so I wasn't planning on opening with population, but I can say that I don't think that we can talk about population without contextualizing it in existing and historical inequalities. And so that's really what I want to get into, is what is driving inequality. And I think that they all do converge. So population inequality and environmental crises all do converge. And so I'm an ecological economist, and from my perspective, inequality and environmental crises are very interdependent because they're driven by the same thing. And that thing is the pursuit of financial gain. So our global economy and its core institutions are set up in a way that measures and defines success in terms of financial gain. So if we think about countries pursuing GDP growth, businesses pursuing profit, individuals being judged as successful based on their salaries or their net worth. And so this pursuit of financial gain drives overconsumption, and along with that, it drives environmental degradation, and it drives inequality. So very shortly, in order to grow GDP and profit, production and consumption have to increase, and that has environmental impacts. Resources have to be extracted, pollution and greenhouse gases are emitted, and that, of course, impacts the climate and wildlife habitats and biodiversity. Likewise, this profit-driven system has an inherent incentive to keep wages as low as possible, and this connects very much with Sharon's work. As wages are a key cost of business, there's an inherent incentive to keep wages as low as possible in order to increase profit. And we see this in the last few decades where wage stagnation has characterized the global economy. Meanwhile, business owners are doing what they're supposed to do, what is deemed rational and successful in this economy. They're accumulating wealth. And so we have wage stagnation, and at the same time, a relatively small group of owners of businesses accumulating wealth, and that drives inequality. And even the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights last summer said the last few decades of economic growth has only really made the wealthiest people wealthier and kept poor people in poverty. And so these are some of the trade-offs between financial gain and social and ecological sustainability. And so we can't just continue to assume, I'll just got 2 more sentences here. We can't continue to assume that financial gain aligns naturally with social and ecological sustainability. We can't go forward in that way. And so an economic transformation for sustainability it requires that we transition the focus of our economic institutions away from financial gain and to focus directly on social and ecological outcomes. So money as a means rather than an end in itself. Thanks.
Thanks, Jennifer. And I had a hint that Jayati wants to join in here.
Yeah, no, I'm so sorry that I would have to leave the meeting for another one just now. I just wanted to come in and thank my fellow panelists because I think what they've said is absolutely incredible. And the real important takeaway, I believe, from this is that the economic model has to change. And it was just emphasized once again by Jennifer. But I think we know how it has to change. Carlotta, all of them have done such amazing work on how it has to change. Sharon has identified the different ways in which policies towards labor and for the macroeconomy can adjust. We know how these things can happen. All we have to do now is to generate enough public demand that governments have to listen. And I think that's why I'm really happy to be proud of this group. And I think together we can actually make a difference. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Jayati, for that very clear, maybe the most powerful level of all, making those public, clear, standing up demands. And Ilona, you had a comment on the population issue that came up here in the chat and that Jennifer touched on.
Yeah, so just shortly, so in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and lifestyle greenhouse gas emissions, it's not a problem of overpopulation or also kind of the poor, because like if you look at the proportions, like 20% of the poorest global population are responsible only for about like 2.5% of global lifestyle greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really the problem that we have too many rich people, so to say, and not that we have too many poor people. Yeah. So I think this is important to keep in mind that it's very unbalanced picture. Thanks.
Excellent. And Carlotta, you opened this with a call for a new Marshall COVID plan, so to speak. Would that address the challenges that Jayati outlined and we've just discussed? And also, how does that converge with the energy issue? So the floor is yours. Please unmute, Carlotta. Carlotta, you're muted.
Okay, thanks for that question. No, really, I think definitely energy is one of the most important elements in this whole thing. But we tend to see energy on the one side and we don't look at materials. And I think energy and materials have to go together because materials are energy. I mean, aluminum is energy, copper is energy, steel is energy. Every material you can imagine is actually energy. So we're not touching that when we're touching just our own thing. So the question is that we need to turn this energy and materials issue into an intense investment and innovation issue. So how do we do that? We have to make energy and materials expensive. But to make them expensive, if we do it country by country with taxation, tariffs, and all this thing, what we get is a race to the bottom, because not every country is going to do the same. And we already have a lot of experience on this race to the bottom thing with finance. So we need pressure. What's going to happen if we do it that way is not only that, but that the companies that are producing the raw materials and the energy in the developing world are going to try to get that taxation tariff money out of the countries. So we're going to have even more difficulty for the developing countries to develop green, because they won't even have the short money that they now get from the materials and from energy. So we need something which seems completely impossible. We need not only to do circular economy, real durability, maintenance, rental economy, all those things, but we actually need to change the prices of materials at source. We need global agreements so that materials and energy will be expensive at the source where the countries produce them, and use that money in some sort of bank, international transparent bank, that will fund only green investment in the developing countries. So we move this money around and turn it into investment. So
that's operationalizing the Marshall Plan, yeah? That's how you...
That's part of the Marshall Plan. It's much bigger than that. But anyway, we need to think big. Institutional innovation. We need to be as big as the welfare state, IMF, World Bank, all those things were created. Sorry, but those things, which are now sometimes seen as very bad, were great then.
Sharon?
Well, Carlotta's right. And if you go back to the history of the creation of the Bretton Woods, indeed, yesterday talking to Ngozi, the history of the WTO, which is only 20 years old, it actually focuses on people and about, as somebody said earlier, shared competition from a genuine point of view. And we need to revisit that. And if necessary, either reform or change or grow new institutions. But I wanted to simply say that, this is a remarkable set of contributions. And Carlotta, we call that big plan a new social contract, and we fight everywhere for a new social contract that has, of course, jobs, climate-friendly jobs with just transition, but it has rights. Let's go back to that peaceful social stability that you talked about, post the two wars and the Great Depression, the birth of the ILO, all of those areas where they said people matter and there must be global standards. And we need new global standards for digitalization, because I agree with you. But it's also about universal social protection and sharing our prosperity for resilience against future shocks. And of course, it's about inclusion with gender and race as well as inequality, as I said. But the SDGs frame this well, but without the economic transformation that you're all talking about, that brings into the model all of the framing that Johan and the rest of you have emphasized, we won't make it. So
Sharon, just a quick add here, because if you have one more minute, there's a question from the chat saying, well, we don't really need more jobs. It's kind of provocative. We need less work. And also, what sort of jobs do we want? This is from Martin Auer. There are jobs that use up resources.
Which is why we have to live within planetary boundaries. But no one's ever going to convince me we don't need less hours of work. That's a different story. But if you actually looked at the fact that if we're talking about people having the opportunity of the dignity of work, and that's the thing, can you choose to have the dignity of decent work or not? And right now, the figures I gave you show the deficit of choice, but they have to be climate-friendly jobs. No question about that.
Jennifer.
Yeah, exactly. I would say that we also have to be talking about, when we're talking about systemic transformation of the economy and new economic models, alternative models, I think we need to be talking, that gets more into how can we have a shorter working week? How can we have, what kind of economic system allows for a shorter working week and allows for expensive materials at source, like Carlota was mentioning. And I would argue that the for-profit economy that we have right now is diametrically opposed to those things. It is exploitative, not by coincidence, but because it's designed to maximize financial gain and at the expense of social and ecological concerns. So we really need to pay a lot of attention into changing the goals in our economic institutions, being very explicit about how and why we do that, and make sure that it's consistent with the donut economy, with meeting the social foundations within the planetary boundaries.
Ilona, did I pick up that you had a comment there?
Yes, well, but maybe shortly, like, no, we don't need just jobs, but we need also meaningful jobs, in terms of jobs that are meaningful, good kind of for the environment and for the societies. I think this is important. So bad jobs make people actually sick. There's some research about it. But I wanted to comment on the prices. I think increasing the prices of materials and energy is important, but we need more. I think we really need kind of more active role of the government, like bans, prohibitions, setting standards, regulations. I think this is what is necessary to bring this kind of rapid level of change that is needed. So examples like countries or also companies kind of removing or excluding some products, or kind of announcing that the combustion engine will be just prohibited, yeah, in some industries. So I think this is the way to go, and that can bring this rapid change that is needed to meet the challenges.
Great. And then, I mean, we speak a lot about transformation and finding the levers that with a great convergence that can have multiple effects, so we can get the economic donut within planetary boundaries. But what, in spite of all this chat and all these panels and all the debates, and I've been in Norwegian Parliament today and debating and nothing happens, what if we'll just continue as is? There's a question here from Ginsberg in the chat. Anybody want to think about that? Will there be war? Will there be chaos? With the slow then fast disintegration of civilization? Is that the way it will go? Anybody want to address that dark side? Ilona, you're unmuted.
Yeah, I can comment about this, sorry, but I did research about it actually. So,
I shouldn't smile, by the way. I should look very great. Yeah.
Well, I should also not smile because it's really serious. But I actually did research about what are the impacts of higher degrees of global warming on socioeconomic systems like human health, agriculture production, energy production, and it's really it's not fun. It's like, for me, more or less, it's the end of the global economy as we know it. It's probably the end of the civilization as we know it. Yes, so there's a problem with models, and a lot of impacts cannot be assessed because we don't have knowledge, or kind of, it means like such complex changes that we cannot somehow that there are not suitable models to show the possible results. But more or less, it's really what I learned, and also kind of what motivated me to do research on climate mitigation, because I think it really means a social collapse, like or a type of social collapse, like and of course we cannot say exactly where it will come from, but we learned that sort of like we cannot keep national borders, yeah, probably as we have set them now, because there will be massive population movements. Yeah, there will be also massive destruction of agricultural crops. So it's like more or less you learn, like you cannot maintain the system as you know it once you get to those higher degrees of global warming. Thanks.
Carlota, is it the case? Are we heading towards a societal collapse, or is that there's the feeling before every techno-economic paradigm shift turns the economy in a new direction?
Yes, that's what I wanted to say, that every time in history, I mean, the 1930s was so horrible. And, you know, everybody was talking about secular stagnation. This is going nowhere. And of course, the war did come on that occasion. It got so bad. And there are all sorts of reasons, which we cannot discuss why there was a war then. Maybe there is going to be a war now. I certainly hope not. I think globalization makes it more difficult, but let's see what happens. But the one thing I do want to say is very important. Every technological revolution has gone through decades of inequality, horrible, the worst of capitalism, really impoverishing the few, the many, enriching the few, being completely unfair in every imaginable way. Then we have somehow a big recession where we get precisely populism and all sorts of anger, xenophobia. It's the Jews or the Mexicans that are guilty. There is all this thing, of course, all these people that are suffering from all the destruction that every technological revolution brings at the beginning. It's creative destruction, and it means also social pain, destruction of regions, the north, the south, really, really bad. And then something happens that makes light come back, and that is a social contract between the sort of center ground. We come to the center ground, and then you get an agreement sort of between business and society. This time we need it between business and society, between advanced, emerging, and developing countries, and between humanity and the planet. So we need a lot of convergence, and this needs very good leaders, but it also needs the young to be fighting not for degrowth, but for changing the nature of growth and for changing the distribution of its fruits. And that is a completely different thing. We cannot feed everybody without growing. We cannot make life better for everybody without growing. We need to change the nature. We need to change the conditions under which growth is made, under which profits are made, under which people are paid, under which people work and have a life. We have to change the conditions, but we don't have to think of stopping growth.
As we have done 4 or 5 times before, yeah?
Sorry?
As we have done 4 or 5 times before,
4 times before, so
Yeah.
this would be the 5th time. And this time we might have an actual lifting of the whole of the world, not just of the workers of the advanced world, which is what happened with mass production, or just of the skilled ones before, and so on. I mean, go back, each time it's only one layer, but this time we have a chance of raising the whole thing with planetary respect. So it's a very complex thing, but it can be done.
Jennifer, you get the last
Yes.
minute.
Okay, great, thanks. So one thing is I have to say that I don't agree with the point about growth, because I think that, so Kate Raworth says it so beautifully, that right now we have an economy that has to grow whether or not people are thriving. And she says that we actually need the economy to make people thrive whether or not the economy is growing. So I think that's the way we need to go. I think that, if we take away all of the private jets and yachts and mansions, multiple mansions that people have, and we stop growing that stuff, and we reallocate economic activity, then maybe we don't need growth. So I think it's worth not focusing on growth and going beyond growth. So that's the post-growth focus. What I wanted to say in this comment was to just highlight some of the great things that are already out there, because we've talked so much about the problem, and I meant to bring some of that into my initial statement, is that there already are existing alternative ways of organizing businesses and markets and economic institutions. There are alternative metrics to guide nations in measuring their progress. There are public health measures, there's ecological measures, not-for-profit forms of business, and social enterprise is something I've been looking at a lot and thinking about an entirely social economy or not-for-profit market economy.
Wonderful. And I have to cut you off there because that's the the schedule, and we have to go on to back to Sandrine and the project. But these issues, like Carlotta is outlining and Jennifer there at the end, exactly those are the issues that we are exploring. How can we really model those new metrics that you speak about? And how can we model that a donut in a dynamic way? And this is what the EarthForAll project is about, and also the psychology of growth. Why do we still get so engaged when we get to the growth issue? What is the psychology of growth in our brains? With those words, thank you so much again, Carlotta, Jennifer, Ilona, Sharon, and Yayati. Sandrine, the screen, I guess, is yours.
Thank you so much, Per Espen. And can I thank each of your incredible female panelists very bright and important insight in terms of your key question, which is around convergence and what does transformational economics mean when we speak about convergence. We heard so much insight, and I want to now bridge that insight into the next session. I think clearly what we heard, and this is fodder for you, Leslie, as we move into this next session around how do we look at the role of philanthropy and funding the transformation. The reason why we wanted to bring forward this session in a session around transformational economics, and also speak to Andrew, as we did before, who is now leading the Bezos Earth Fund, was to start to draw the links between that shift of capital that we need to have now, not just in the technology, as we always speak about, that is going to move us to net zero, but into the projects that are going to ensure that we actually do start to put forward transformational economic models, and that we get decision makers to adopt those models. And there are a series of philanthropic organizations across the globe that are starting to get interested. And in particular, we've asked Leslie Johnson, CEO of Laudes Foundation, to spearhead this conversation and to guide it. But I want to have a call out also to the Angela Bennett Foundation, who is also co-funding with Leslie and Laudes some of the work that we're doing through EarthForAll and the transformational economics work. And the shout out to the philanthropic organizations is such that if we are truly going to shift in the next decade, there is no time to waste. We must optimize capital flows to enable those projects, that deep thinking about what transformational economics means, that grand Marshall Plan, and unpack the tensions between the social and the green, and ensure that we bring more people on the journey, but also more parties on the journey. We've seen in Europe in particular that there is some convergence actually around green and also multicolors, as Jayata has said, because we have a card-carrying conservative as president of the European Commission who has put forward a green and social deal. This is no longer just a discussion around the green movement, but has actually become very much a party position and platform. And we are hopeful that we will see the same across the globe. So Leslie, I'm going to allow you now to introduce your incredible panel.
Great.
A panel that was specifically chosen because we know the interest of all the panelists in really playing an important role. But I guess the call out again is, how can we then bring forward even more philanthropic organizations to be on this journey with us and to enable this transformational change to occur in the very, very short timeline that we have, as we know we're in the midst of a planetary emergency. So over to you.
Great. Thank you, Sandrine. And it's really hard to follow you. You're so inspiring, and I hope we can keep up. So good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really honored to chair this panel. Just want to give a little bit of background to what we're doing on our side before I introduce our esteemed speakers. My name is Leslie Johnson. I'm the CEO of Laudes Foundation, which is a new kid on the block that is joining this movement, this growing movement to accelerate the transition to what we see should be a climate positive and inclusive economy. So we heard a lot about that already in the discussion to date, and we know that we need to transition because what got us here is not going to get us to where we need to go. And we need to be in a world where markets actually work for both people and the planet that we need to cherish. So that's why we as Laudes Foundation are here. And we're here to join others to really help to use philanthropic capital to incentivize investors to put a value on what's important, to incentivize business to challenge itself, to harness its power for good, and to nurture that new economic thinking that we just heard about in the last panel that's so important for what we want to build toward. And that's why we, as Sandrine said, along with the Angela Wright Bennett Foundation, are an early supporter of the EarthForAll project and those implementing partners working on it, including Club of Rome, Potsdam Institute, Stockholm Resilience Center, Norwegian Business School, Because if we want to see the transformation that we want in our lifetimes, we need to understand how to get there. And Club of Rome's inclusive coalition is a great way to get that political will in place to do the change that we want to see. So very exciting, and I'm very, very proud to be here. But why are we here? Well, we are in a crisis. We know 2050 is too late, and therefore it's all hands on deck. And we're here today in this panel to dig deeper on the role that philanthropy can play on this deck. It's not a silver bullet, but it can play, in my view, a very unique role. Earlier in the session, Sandrine talked about social tipping points, the role of social movements, political action, technological innovation. That's all great stuff that spurs action. And often philanthropy is behind those types of initiatives. So I'm here today with 3 heavy hitters from the philanthropy space to explore exactly what that looks like. And I hope by the end of the 45 minutes that we have, we would have been able to highlight where philanthropy should and perhaps should not play, what's working, maybe what's not working, and where we all collectively need to up our game. So continuing with the deck analogy, let's dive in. And I would like to introduce our panel, starting with Ellen. Ellen Dorsey is the Executive Director of the Wallace Global Fund, a private foundation focused on progressive social change in the fields of environment, democracy, human rights, and corporate accountability, one of my favorite topics. She's a long-standing champion for aligning investments with grant making, having launched the Divest, Invest Philanthropy Initiative. And she may not know this, but she's my personal hero for having published an op-ed last year that called on philanthropy to get a move on and declare a climate emergency already. So thank you for being here, Ellen, and for pushing funders to be more bold. Secondly, we have Felicite von Peter, who is the managing partner of Active Philanthropy, a platform for funders and foundations from across Europe who want to make a lasting difference in protecting the planet for future generations. Having worked with funders across the spectrum, from large institutions to high net worth individuals, Felicite is one of the few people I know who deeply understands the fast-moving European philanthropy industry, quote unquote. And I've had the pleasure of being advised by Felicite almost 10 years ago, if she can remember that, and I can assure you she's very good at what she does. So welcome, Felicite. It's great to have you here. And last but not least, Tom. Tom Steinbach is someone who wears many hats. He is the executive director of Tempest Advisors, where he leads a team of philanthropy experts focused on addressing climate change in the US and abroad. And as part of that, he's the executive director for both the Sea Change Foundation and the Sea Change Foundation International, 2 foundations focused solely on climate mitigation and one of the larger climate funders globally with work spanning Europe, the US, and Asia. I could share more of the hats that Tom wears, but I think it would make the rest of us feel a little bit like underachievers. So let's go ahead and get started. And thank you, Tom, for being here and for bringing all of your hats. So just to summarize, this is a panel on how philanthropy can unlock the funding needed for economic transformation. But we all know when compared to public sector funds or even business investment or finance, the level of philanthropic funding out there is small, it's minuscule. So the first question I'd love to ask our panelists is, why bother? Why is philanthropy even needed if it's so small? How can it actually be impactful in accelerating this transition? Let's start with Ellen. Would love to hear from you first and also understand how your foundation is working to enable this change. Over to you.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate, Leslie and Sandrine, and all the wonderful speakers that preceded this panel. You know, philanthropy's funding is vital to building the power and strategies needed to usher in systemic change, to transform the energy base of our economy, to change the fundamental operating system of the global economy, to ensure that economic, racial, and gender justice is centered in the alternatives we build, requires strong, powerful movements that can stand up to economic and bureaucratic vested interests that will block the change that is required for our survival. Philanthropy can help build the countervailing power needed to unlock change and advance the strategies that can be effective in the narrow window of time that we have left. However, I think it's a serious question whether philanthropy is acting at the scale or with the required sense of urgency, or even the same urgency that we are demanding of governments and businesses. We did begin 2020 calling for philanthropy to declare a climate emergency. If we're serious about holding our own sector or our practices to the standards of an emergency, what would we do differently? We have to answer that question. But now in 2021, philanthropy also faces a moral emergency. The economic crisis we face is unprecedented. The disconnect between capital and labor markets, accelerated under the weight of the global pandemic, has brought grotesque suffering and deepened inequality. And we know that the transformation of the economy is urgent for climate and urgent for basic human rights. So I'll say 5 quick things that I think philanthropy needs to do. We need to radically collaborate in ways unheard of in philanthropy. We don't collaborate at scale. All too often, we develop our own strategies and feel pride in their uniqueness. We need to fund, advocate, and model intersectional system change. We need to, as has been said, center economic, racial, and gender justice in our responses. We need to support the new social compact, advance corporate accountability, transform financial systems as integral to our climate approaches. We have to support movements, understand we need to build power that is great enough to disrupt entrenched power. And that's scary for a lot of foundations. Very few foundations fund movements. While we need smart, savvy, professional NGOs doing great work, it's not enough. We need to align our investments with our program priorities. Let's be clear. You can't invest in companies driving the problems with 95% of your assets and then with 5% make grants to organizations that you asked to clean up the mess. It is completely wrong. We need to spend more. Most foundations are spending only 5% of their endowments. Now, think about this. If we're facing intersecting compounding crises, why are foundations growing their endowments? Over the last 5 years, most foundations had annual returns of 10%. Last year, 12 to 20%. We need to put our excess and excessive returns into play. Double your grant making. Why are we hoarding our acorns? Will there be another colder winter? Put the money into play now. Our foundation is 100% mission aligned. We've been out of fossil fuels since 2011. We're invested 15% in climate solutions, 5% in impact investments where we accept a fair return as opposed to a market return, and we're still crushing our benchmarks. Last year, we paid out 20% of our endowment. Because of the compounding crisis, because of the unique moment, we're funding the youth movement, the divestment movement, the movement calling for a Green New Deal, movements demanding economic system change, and fighting for racial justice. Again, if it's a climate emergency, if it's a moral emergency, are we acting like it? And it's time we step up and act like it.
Thank you, Ellen. This confirms why you're my personal hero. Absolutely. We need to get out of our comfort zones, everyone. Hopefully we have funders listening and actually start disrupting. So thank you for those opening remarks. Let me hand it to Felicite. Felicite, you've seen a lot in your advisory work over the years. Why do you think philanthropy is needed? And do you see funders are starting to wake up more in this respect? And do you see funders doing what Ellen is calling out should be done?
Well, I wish we had more funders like Ellen, because if we had, we wouldn't have the conversation we have now, seriously. Because I think a lot of funders still haven't realized that climate change is not something for the tree huggers and the green foundations. It's something that affects all of us. And I think that's also part of the problem. And I totally agree with Ellen that philanthropy is crucial for establishing all sorts of connections and baselines for funders to come together. I mean, we know what needs to happen, but the discussion how to make it happen has just started. And we know some people don't agree with what we think needs to happen. And there's going to be resistance. There's going to be change. We see that in Germany with a potential green chancellor. We see an enormous surge of parties from the extreme right and left tackling the environmental cause. So we know that transformation means a shift in power, and it means a shift in how we do things. And that's why we need philanthropy as a space to have these uncomfortable discussions, because some people will lose out. Yes, we will not be able to take the 5th flight a year without paying an extra cost. So philanthropy can really provide a space for having these debates, having these conversations, bringing different voices to the table that we've not seen in the debate so far. And that's one of this convening power is one of the crucial things philanthropy has done in the past. But I think the other part that philanthropy can do is to help people understand the interconnectedness of the problem. Climate is a social justice problem. It's a gender equality problem. It is a problem that affects all the traditional funders topics. And that's what we're seeing in our work, that a lot of the funders simply are not yet aware how climate change impacts their work and their mission. And so we think that there is also a big need for philanthropy to establish an infrastructure outside that climate bubble that we're all in, that is frightfully small. I mean, if you look at the number of big climate funders in the last 10, 15 years, you can count them on 3 hands. It's staggering. You know, I've been looking at this field for 20 years and I've always wondered, why are there always the same people around? On the upside, we now have some big funders that have an enormous amount of experience and expertise that they can bring to help new funders come on board. But I think we also need philanthropy to build this infrastructure to help funders join the field and to see how the climate crisis intersects with what they do. And to build these alliances that Alan talked about between the climate funders and those that are new to climate, but that will be affected either because they fund in health or education or you name it. So I think that's one of the crucial ways also for foundations to establish a new field. And that's something foundations have been doing for a long time. You know, Carnegie built a field in adult education. Rockefeller was crucial in the Green Revolution and the Ford Foundation. We now need foundations to really establish this new field of climate philanthropy in a different way that we've seen it so far. And so that's also an appeal to the established climate funders to support that as well. And I know, Laudis, you're doing a lot in supporting the national and international funders' commitment on climate change, which is an amazing entry for new funders to join the field.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. And I think that's a great segue to Tom, because when we talk about getting funders out of their climate bubble, and it is a very small number of funders, I agree. You know, Tom, you have a very focused climate lens, and would love to hear your view. How do you see the role of philanthropy, particularly given the trillions and trillions that's needed to tackle the climate crisis?
First, Leslie, thank you. And what a pleasure it is to be with Ellen and Felicite here. I'm in California and the sun's just coming up. And so that's making me feel hopeful. So I'm going to try to stay on the hopeful side. Change is coming. Ellen and Felicite just said it. It is coming. And the question is whether philanthropy is going to be relevant to that change or not. We are small by comparison. And in my view, or something I want to throw out, is we should be society's risk capital. We should be willing to take risks with these resources. And generally speaking, philanthropy doesn't do that. It often plays it safe. And if we're in a climate emergency, as Ellen has pointed out, we are. We need to behave that way, and we need to behave in a way that we're willing to take risks. A couple points I just want to throw in for the mix. I think our big levers for philanthropy are to try to influence what government does, what the public sector does, and what businesses do. Those are the deep pockets. Those are the places, those are the places of high leverage. And philanthropy ought to be working very hard to help set the rules of the road, that the way government does around economy, and to push businesses, push and encourage businesses to really embrace and accelerate the change that's coming. So those, in my view, are our levers. And Ellen, I want to call back to your comment about movements. For sure, movements have a critical role to play in pulling both those levers. And I think in general, philanthropy has been shy about engaging in movements and figuring out how to do it. Part of that, if I think about my own experience, is we don't understand them. And so we keep arm's length from them, where we behave in a way that we're almost afraid of them. And that feels upside down to me. If I were to behave in a way that is deploying society's risk capital, well, we ought to be willing to take those risks. We ought to be willing to have some failures and to point to those failures and learn from them. And I don't see us doing that to the extent we can and should. So I'll stop there.
Fantastic, Tom. Thank you. And I want to dig a little bit more into risks and risk taking, because I think starting with Ellen's comments about power and movements, and by backing movements, you're sticking your neck out, because these tend to be the disruptive things that really try to nudge the change we need. Why is it philanthropic foundations aren't taking risks? Because they should. I mean, they don't need to make a profit. They could actually think long term. A lot of them, are funded by endowments that are there unless you're spending down, which probably all of us should do. What is it that keeps foundations from taking the risk needed here? Anyone want to pop in?
I'll just say an obvious point. Part of why foundations don't take risk is the origins of the foundations themselves, the creation of great wealth that grew out of the existing economic system. And there's a fundamental question about whether we're willing to take on that system that produced that wealth, even when we know that system change is required to achieve our missions. It's almost culturally outside of the framework of the origins of almost any philanthropic institution. And I think, to the point about funding movements, we see there's like our currency is writing a transactional check to an NGO. Thinking about funding movements means you have to step back, think very differently about how money gets used. And you can't control movements in the same way that you can ask an NGO to present a proposal to you with bean counting metrics. Kind of hard to have bean counting metrics for, unruly movements that you can't really direct. So, but it's what's required now. So we have to figure it out. Full stop.
Absolutely. And there was a question coming, I think, in the chat about the percentage of funding coming from philanthropic capital versus corporate taxation. So Ellen, you called out the origin of philanthropy. Of course, it comes from tax breaks from corporates. And Felicite, you had talked about both Carnegie and Rockefeller, who of course made their millions on steel and oil, which are the two industries that we're trying to tackle to be, more climate friendly. So is that a paradox? And I guess, what I'm trying to get at is the amount of funding we have is so small. Should we even exist as philanthropy?
I love Leslie, that you always ask these hardball questions. And out of great respect for Sandrine and her wonderful way of calling a spade, I'll quote something that I was once told. Someone said, foundations are not about the bottom line. Foundations are about the ego line. And I think that's a big problem that we have today, that because of this power dynamic between foundations having wealth and recipients needing that wealth, we have a lack of willingness to do stuff that can be exposed as critical, as risky, because you don't want to put your reputation on the line. And there is this power dynamic that still assumes once people have created that wealth, they also know what to do with it. But the amazing thing is we see a great shift in that. We see a new generation of funders that have inherited wealth, that question that power dynamics, and that are going to fund, I think, in a very different way, this whole notion of participatory grant making, seeing yourself as a partner of movements, because you don't want to control. You want to be part of the solution, and you see that your money is just one aspect of the entire solution that is needed. I think that is something that gives me great hope for also a very different way of funder we're seeing emerging today.
Fantastic. And that is a great segue to the second question I wanted to ask, because I do want to go a bit deeper on this concept of power that I think, Ellen, you had first raised. We're all here, of course, because in our own ways, we're working to accelerate this transformation of our global economic system that we want to see. But it's really hard, as we know, and because it really entails changing, the dominant paradigm, changing the mindsets, the ideas, the incentives, even the power dynamics within the system. And so I'd love to hear from each of you in your experience, how has philanthropy been successful at really tackling these more deeply rooted issues? And we're getting into Danilo Meadows territory here. So when we're looking at kind of the leverage points for changing a system, you know, those deeply rooted ideas and norms that govern people's behavior. Tom, let's start with you. Would you love to hear your perspective on what's working?
What's working? A couple thoughts to throw out, and I'd love to get in conversation with Ellen and Felicite on these too. First, a tie back to the earlier conversation. Philanthropy in the climate space is collaborating to a degree that I haven't seen in other sectors, and not to say we've got it, because I don't think we do. But we're heading in the right direction. And part of this is coming from the reality that every philanthropy that works on climate understands that alone they are, you know, kind of screaming in the wilderness. Coming together, they have the beginnings of power and influence that could help to drive some of the solutions forward. So I just want to acknowledge that there's a lot of collaboration going on within philanthropy now. We need a lot more. I just think we've got the beginnings of what looks very promising to me. So I want to acknowledge that. Then over to some solutions, or some things that seem promising to me as solutions. Many governments around the world are going to spend unprecedented amounts of money now as we hopefully emerge from the global pandemic. We've got a long way to go. And if I just think about my home country here, the United States, the president has put forward a $2 trillion plan, at least half of which is arguably aimed at things that address climate change. Our opportunity and challenge within philanthropy is to work very hard to make sure that money lands in a way that delivers on the there were five, right, Ellen? 5 principles that she laid out, right? Let's make sure that we actually deliver climate solutions. Let's make sure these dollars are delivered in a way that drives equity forward. Let's make sure we're creating high quality jobs and communities with this money. This is a tremendous opportunity. The fact that we are here is not an accident, and philanthropy has played a role in getting to this place where dollars are aimed or beginning to be aimed at, public dollars are beginning to be aimed at these solutions. So I think that's one area that feels promising to me, and also like we've got a lot of work in front of us right now. A second is 2 parts of I'll be brief on this, but 2 parts in the private sector. Both the sort of the encouraging part, there's some examples of philanthropy working, for example, in Southeast Asia to de-risk investments in clean energy, to make it more possible for investments to come in from businesses, and also to push incumbents, working to get coal mines and coal power plants closed, and doing the organization and working with local communities and really listening to ensure that we're getting coal out of the system. So those feel like examples, positive examples to me.
Fantastic. And I love how strategic litigation is seen as a positive example. It's wonderful. It's the role that philanthropy should play if it wants to be bold. Ellen, would love to hear your thoughts. Where has philanthropy been successful and why? And would also love to hear your thoughts on why you think it's important to mobilize not only the grant making side of philanthropy, but also the investments.
I can tie both those questions into a good example, to cite an example of philanthropy's role in shifting power dynamics and supporting a movement that also deployed both grant resources and investment capital. And that's supporting the movement that pushed on a particular leverage point, a kind of acupressure point, unlocking change, the movement calling for divestment from fossil fuels, and the investment in climate solutions. I'll do this quickly, a little short summary. Flashback to 2009, 2010, when the world failed in getting a global climate deal at Copenhagen. National legislation failed in the United States. It was clear that the power of the fossil fuel industry was a primary barrier to change. Youth activists understood that pushing on failed policy wasn't working anymore, and it was time to turn the target to the industry itself, and began campaigning on their campuses for divestment from fossil fuels in 2011. Then the brilliant Mark Campanelli of Carbon Tracker, who, if I may say, should be a Nobel recipient, published his stranded asset analysis, and Bill McKibben linked the campus divestment to that analysis, and 40 campaigns on campuses already underway went to 400 overnight. Philanthropy stepped in, helped fund the spread of that movement, the organizing, the activism, taking it to churches, taking it to pensions, taking it to cities. And we organized philanthropy as a sector of the movement. And the reason for doing that was not to look at ourselves and say, aren't we great that we're committing to divest? It was to say that using our investments, we could help drive the market for fossil-free products. We could have investment portfolios that work, that we could hold up and say, yeah, you can be divested and get the returns that you need. In fact, actually, the data is pretty clear, better returns. Now this movement has spread so much across the world that over 1,000 institutions have committed to divest publicly. The Pope has called for fossil fuel divestment. It's a centerpiece of Greta's demands. Close to 15 trillion has been divested. And arguably that movement also cracked open the financial system as an instrument of action on climate change, and in turn is helping to change the standards by which the financial system is being held. Divest, invest, philanthropy, foundations concede solutions. We can, on the invest side, invest in solutions that governments and businesses won't, making sure that the 800 million across the world that don't have access to electricity are brought into the energy transition, get capital into extractive communities to support displaced workers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I have been honored to be part of a movement where I think philanthropy played an important role in helping to support a movement, unlock change, and be responsive to that movement's demands. Any of the foundations or donors on this call that want to join that movement, you can find me very easily.
Excellent. And Ellen, would that have happened without philanthropy, but just more slowly?
It didn't get a lot of grant capital. To be quite honest, there are times that I think maybe the revolution won't be funded, but there was critical funding at critical and strategic moments. And I really would call out the Sainsbury's played an important role in helping us fund, and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, who came in and also pledged their own commitment, which was pivotal because it was the heirs of Exxon and Mobil, and their commitment to divest really was game-changing. So using your advocacy voice and your public capital is also important. So yeah, I think it wouldn't have happened quite in the same way or grown as rapidly.
Yeah, absolutely. And you call out also really important tool in philanthropy. It's not just the checks we write, but it's the influence that we can bring to the table and the voice that we have. So wonderful answer. Felicite, would love to hear your perspective. What's a good example in your experience?
Thanks, and Leslie, I'm so glad you just called out this trias that foundations can use to have impact, not just with a portfolio, but also with the finances and with being vocal and being advocates, especially those that are still struggling to find a connection to climate can do so much with their finance. And Ellen has just named one of the most powerful examples, so that's fantastic. I think I want to name two very brief examples. One is both are connected to broadcasting, to communication, and to shifting power. One is the Yale Climate Connections that show in very simple ways how the climate crisis connects to the lives of everyday people and highlights creative solutions coming from the bottom up. The other one is Global Green Grants, which is a very old, fantastic organization that shifts the power and the ability to act to those that know best, which is local people. Both show two things that I think philanthropy can do and where we need more of. And that is to create a vision to help us to imagine this new future. We all know that imagining is one of our most important creative capacities. And I think what we need is, we need a new language and we need a new vision of this transformation we need to embody and we need to work towards. And it's something that funders can do really well, because I think we've been coming from the negative, but we can create this future. You know, we're masters of this future. And I think personally, it's an enormously exciting time to live in, because we can create this future we want to aspire to. And that's where foundations can be very important, with funding this new narrative, storytelling, imagining of what this transition should look like.
Fantastic. And thank you, Felicite. And sometimes I feel like you're a fly on the wall when we developed our strategy, because reimagining the system is one of the approaches that we outlined at Loudest. Let me just ask a follow-up question on that, because I think that when you look historically at how foundations have operated, we're not very good at funding ideas. And I've been very inspired by Larry Kramer at Hewlett, because he's very much pushing, for more foundations to really get involved in funding ideas that can shift that dominant paradigm. If you look at conservative funders, they've been very successful at funding ideas. The whole rise in neoliberal capitalism and University of Chicago, I mean, all that was really thanks to a lot of support that was quietly given over a long period of time. So if we're not good at ideas, if we just want to fund actions, how do we get over that? Because to reimagine the system, we have to think big, and this is not short-term KPIs. This is big out-of-box thinking. So what do we need to do differently?
I think we need to take the time to really realize that this imagining is crucially important, because we are being driven so much from a short-termism of reacting and acting and setting example, and this is a messy future. Nobody knows how we should get there, and I think we're not taking enough time to listen to those that are at the receiving end, so to speak. I think this new trend to work collaboratively with people on the ground, participatory groundmaking, listening to the communities is hugely important, because there's so much energy and so much creativity from people on the ground. And I think if we do that and imagine this future together, we can overcome a lot of this power imbalance. The solutions are out there. All we need to do as funders is get down to the ground and listen and take time and together decide what is important, what works for the communities that we want to serve. And that is a wonderful exploratory way that I think any funder should want to get on board with.
Before I go to a couple of questions that have come in, Ellen or Tom, do you want to react to any of these comments?
I just want to say, actually, I think we are funding in a way that embraces the scale of the change that needs to happen. We haven't been afraid of the ideas, Leslie. I mean, just a very simple example is philanthropy has been quite good about saying, this is an emergency, right? Ellen, I think we can do more, but I do think that we're doing that, and we're combining that with the solutions are available to us. Those are seemingly simple things to say, and they're fairly radical ideas, right? We are coming behind them, and we're coming behind them with weight. So I want to challenge a little bit the presumption that we're somehow shy about diving into these big changes that need to happen. We are doing that. We need to do a lot more of it. I don't want to overstate it either, but we're there. Then I also would just like to acknowledge that we have to find ways to accelerate what we're doing. It feels small, too small, and too slow. So it's not so much that we have to come up with radically new ideas. We actually have a lot of those. Our challenge is to be able to expand on them and move them more quickly. Time is of the essence, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to throw it back to Ellen and get your reaction to Tom's comments. trying to start a fight here.
Well, I never shy away from a good fight, but I actually want to agree with both Tom and Felicitas, but with a little bit different of a spin. I don't think we shy away from big ideas in philanthropy, and that I would say that the way that we do it is often not the right approach. Often we put a lot of money into big idea generation or big academic system, analysis, and we actually are not in the same position of the right, or where the right was 40 years ago, because we don't have the time. We don't have the time for long-term study and analysis and idea generation and curating big ideas. And as was said, our movements have solutions. And there is something that's really wrong about us thinking that we can generate the big ideas and the solutions. Our movements have solutions, and our movements are calling for intersectional solutions and are organizing at a scale that has not been seen in this world for 40 or 50 years. What I think we're called to do is to listen and to fund those movements to achieve those solutions at scale. And I will go back to saying, if you're sticking with your 5% and growing your endowment year in and year out, when money is needed to push those solutions and get them to scale, shame on us. We have a responsibility to put our money to play. And our investments, whole nother piece of that. But just the sheer amount of funding is not enough. Bring it, bring more, bring till it hurts, and maybe spend down, because more wealth is being created every day.
Thank you, Ellen. And I think we only have a few more minutes, so I want to just fast forward 20, 25 years. And you're talking to your grandchildren, you're sitting at your seaside bungalow, and the sea levels have not risen because you've been very successful in all your work as a philanthropic institution. And would love to hear from you. Fast forward, what, looking back, is the one thing that you did now that contributed to the success that you saw? And if you could phrase that as, advice for funders now, what's that one thing that you're very proud of? Felicite, over to you.
Get them to listen to funders like Leslie, Ellen, and Tom, which would get them started. I think that's the most important thing. Get started now, no matter where. There is enough opportunities out there. There are enough funders to help you get on board. Everyone at the school, Club of Rome, amazing possibilities. Just get going. Throw overboard the fear of the unknown. We can shape the future, we can shape the world. To me, it's an enormously exciting place and time to work in.
Wonderful. So I will rephrase that as get a move on, funders. Tom, over to you.
Well, first, I hope I'm not sitting, that I'm still active, because this change is generational. We need successes soon, and we need successes in the future, and we're going to need to be at this for a generation. So I'm hoping that I'm not sitting down. I'm hoping that I'm still leaning in. And then maybe if I'm looking back, I would hope that I took risks, that I was willing to try things, willing to listen to others, and willing to make mistakes. And I just that notion that Felicite put out of get started, let's go, fully embrace that.
Fantastic. Thank you. Ellen.
Well, I like a good seaside resort along with the rest of us, but I hope first, like Tom said, I've handed the baton in philanthropy, this privileged position, but I hope that instead of sitting at the seaside resort reminiscing, I hope I'm getting arrested with my grandchildren. I hope I'm protesting with my grandchildren. We will always need to defend justice within broken systems. We're never going to get it right. Even if we make the progress we need in 25 years on climate, water will be privatized and people will be desperate for water. There will always be fights that we need to stand up for the right thing. And I hope I'm annoying granny who, the kids are like, oh God, she did it again. Like, it's so embarrassing. But And then go to the resort occasionally. Let's be clear, we all want that too.
Excellent. Thanks, Ellen. I'm going to think of you as a crazy grandma now from now on. So thank you, everyone. Just a few words to close. This has been a brilliant dialogue. Philanthropy is so important and can play such an important role. But what I heard from you all is that we need to take risks. We need to stick our necks out. We need to act urgently. And that means we need to sometimes do things that are uncomfortable. And that's not easy for a lot of philanthropic funders. I think it's also important that we recognize we have many tools. I mean, Ellen talked about the endowment. There's tools in our grant making. There's tools in our influence. Let's use those and let's exert the influence that we need and have that intersectional view that we need to be successful. So I would like to end with just a call out to any funders who are on the line. Please be brave. Please be comfortable with discomfort. Please work together. As Tom said, there is more and more collaboration, but it's really just not enough. And please be willing to address the power dynamics, not only in the industries and systems we're trying to change, but also in philanthropy itself. You know, are we putting money where our mouth is? Are we using our own capital to try to change the flow of capital in the system? These are all questions we should be asking ourselves, because at the end of the day, we have no time to lose. So thank you to all three of you for your really insightful comments. I'm very honored to be here with you all and wish you all the best.
Wow, thank you so much, Leslie, for incredible chairing of this session, and to the panelists, Ellen, Felicite, and Tom, for all of your wisdom. I'm going to try to summarize very quickly some of the key challenges and the championing that I heard. First of all, Ellen, I could not agree with you more. If we're all still sitting on an island, let's just hope, first of all, we will still have islands. I think that's the number one issue. And let's remember that many of our islands, by the way, will be gone by 2030. So just to remind ourselves that we are in an emergency. We should all be much more provocative, as you were today. Very brave voices in trying to indicate that not only should we ensure that we have provocation with regard to new economic models, but that also within the structures that we have in the philanthropic movement, but also other funding and capital flows, that we really shift those flows to where they need to go. We heard about the need, and thank you, Felicite, for bringing this up, because it is my key call to action and calling a spade a spade. We have to shift from the ego to the eco. And this very much builds on what we were all asked to do today when we started with our Transformational Economics panel, which was to think about convergence versus divergence. And what we heard in the first part of our discussions with some transformational economics, but also multidisciplinary thinkers, was that we need to think about a grand Marshall Plan. As Carlotta told us, this is the time to put in place a great plan of action, very similar to our planetary emergency plan, a plan that looks at jobs and livelihoods as part of the way in which we can continue economic development, not pushing growth. That we need to ensure that we take into consideration complexity within everything that we do, but also that we simplify the transfer of funds, that we ensure that those capital flows go where they need to go, not only technology, but new models for change, and that we absolutely usurp the continuous short-term thinking so that we put in place long-term thinking, the ancestor approach, the fact that we will still be here for many generations, and that we ourselves must make those decisions now to ensure that those generations are there. That means, as Ellen said, that we need to radically collaborate, that we need to optimize funding and capital, that we need to think about social and also green movements together, and that we need to bring all of this and encompass this in this Grand Marshall Plan. And as Jayati so clearly reminded us, this is about a multicolored society. It's not about green, it's not about red, it's about all the different colors and ensuring that we bring in all the right partners to enhance equitable economic development across the globe. We're very hopeful with the EarthForAll project that we can start to at least bring forward what some of those alternative futures, Felicite, that you were asking for look like. that we can bring that into a broader group of not only philanthropists and many great leaders like yourselves in the philanthropy movement, but also people on the street, so that they understand that there are different types of futures that enable them to live healthy and very thriving lives within their communities. So I want to thank all of the partners for this particular event. Ensure that we continue to stand by our principles and to call for transformational change, to put in place collectively what those solutions are, and to ensure that we get the capital that's necessary, both from philanthropy, but also from the investment community, to really move into underpinning that absolutely necessary change that will build resilience to future crises, whether they be health crises, climate crises, or continued biodiversity loss. I will end with that and wish you all a very healthy and happy rest of the day.